Welcome to Rex Factor!
This week, Eleanor Parker, the last Anglo-Saxons. With your hosts, Graham Duke and Ali Hood.
Hello.
Hello.
And welcome to Rex Factor, where we are reviewing all the nearly monarchs of England and the United Kingdom, from Æthelwold to Albert Victor, the people who could or should have become monarch, but for the intervention of fate.
It could be called Rex Factor Gutted.
Well, I'd probably save that maybe for the Harold Godwinson episode. Or
Nice, nasty.
Now, we've just finished, of course, our first mini-series covering the Saxon and one Viking nearly monarchs. So we've got a couple of interviews.
Have we finished a series?
Mini-series. So
yeah, but mini-series.
Well, we haven't actually recorded Harold and Edgar yet. So we've actually got two more to do.
Right.
But by the time this episode comes out, we will have released them.
I don't even think of them as Saxons. I mean, I know...
Harold isn't, he's Viking.
Oh, Harold rather than Harold.
Mm.
But by then, it's like... It's a generational change. This is why the Vikings never stood a chance, because there was a wind of change, and it's not...
It's not their time.
It's not their time.
Mm.
I mean, that could be the name of this series. It's not their time.
Not their time, yeah. Well, so we have obviously just released those episodes on Harold Godwinson and Edgar the Ætheling.
Weren't they good?
Weren't they great episodes? So we've got a couple of interviews lined up to reflect on the period. This is the second of those interviews. We haven't done any yet, but this is the second one.
Mm.
And in fact, it will be the third interview that we've done, because the first interview we released before we even released Æthelwold, but we haven't recorded that one yet either.
God, it's like working with Doc Brown.
So we are speaking today to Eleanor Parker about effectively sort of the last Anglo-Saxons, the last children of Anglo-Saxon England, to quote the subtitle of her book. So, we often see the Saxon story stopping at Hastings, but as we saw with Edgar the Ætheling, he keeps on going, bless him.
He does, and I don't know how.
There's this whole afterlife for these young Saxons who aren't at Hastings, they aren't wiped out in the Conquest, and yet how do they accommodate themselves? How do they cope with the Norman Conquest? What happens to them? What do they make of the tumultuous events?
Yeah, because if they play the cards right, you stand a chance of surviving this.
Mm.
But one slip.
But equally, they don't know that this is it forever. The Viking conquest didn't last for very long. Mm-hmm. Maybe this one will pass over.
Mm.
So it's a whole generation that had to come to terms with it that we don't often look at. So that is what we're going to be speaking to Eleanor about today. So we are very happy to be joined on the podcast today by the historian Eleanor Parker. Eleanor, thanks so much for joining us.
Hello, nice to be here.
Could you just give listeners just a quick sort of introduction to yourself in terms of who you are and what you do?
So I'm a medievalist and I teach medieval English literature at Brasenose College, Oxford. But my interests kind of lie between literature and history, so that's kind of where I'm coming from.
Nice. Now, we're going to be talking to you today, particularly looking at your book, Conquered, the Last Children of Anglo-Saxon England. I think I first encountered you a blog that you wrote. I'm not sure, are you still doing it now? Have you stopped?
Not so much, no. That was, a Clerk of Oxford was my blog, but I don't tend to do that. Don't do that very much more. No.
I really enjoyed that. I got some fun little stories from the podcast, various different series back, and things to annoy Ali about when I needed Dunstan information.
Yeah, I remember that.
Good news is there's more Dunstan to come.
Excellent.
So the reason we wanted to speak to you about the book and about that today is that we've just finished doing our mini-series on nearly monarchs from the Anglo-Saxon period. And I think I'm probably guilty of this as well, but I feel like a lot of people sort of imagine that we have the Battle of Hastings and then that's it. The Saxons are done, they're finished, and now it's the Normans. But actually, of course, there's this whole lot of people who are Saxons and are in England and are going to have to come to terms with what's happened, and they're not all just kind of ordinary people living their lives. They're quite important people that might have expected to have quite prominent roles to play that have to come to terms with it in some way. So it feels almost like it's a nearly generation of Saxons. That's kind of why we wanted to talk to you about it today. What sort of drew you to this as a topic to write about?
Well, I think it was actually very much what you're saying about this sense that, we all know the Norman Conquest as this huge moment of change in English history, kind of the end of one Anglo-Saxon world and then the beginning of the Norman world, and, things change really fast. But then, of course, if you think about it as an event that people were living through and experiencing, things don't happen like that in real life, do they? That everything changes overnight and nothing's ever going to be the same again. There were people who had to kind of live through that transition and come to terms with what it meant for them personally, for their families, for their own hopes about their life. And particularly the idea of the nearly generation. I mean, very much, as you say, people who would have expected to be powerful in England if the Norman Conquest hadn't happened, the members of prominent families who probably would have gone on to be king or earl or whatever. And then that didn't happen because of the Norman Conquest. I was really interested in that sense of, their lives kind of suddenly changing and how they dealt with the consequences of that.
Some better than others, though. Who's that fellow that I really like?
Edgar.
No.
Oh.
The Ætheling.
Yeah.
Edgar. Oh, it sounded odd you saying his name without the Ætheling bit on the end. Yeah, him. What a life. He sort of made the most of it, though.
Yeah. He's really interesting. I mean, he's absolutely one where we stopped talking about him after, the conquest and then like the Battle of Hastings and then, the rebellions afterwards. And then people just like, okay, Edgar Ætheling, his life just stopped at that point. But actually he lived on for decades afterwards.
Yeah.
Interesting things.
Yeah. Just sort of able to check out of one storyline and go swimming in all the opportunity of the next. It's nice.
So how did you decide sort of who you're going to be focusing on? Because I sort of was thinking, reading the book, that almost any one of the chapters could have almost been like their own book, their own thing. So were you ever tempted to just sort of write about one person, or was it always going to be this kind of collective picture?
I think I like the idea of a kind of group biography, partly because, we don't have tons of information about most of these people. Their lives are kind of quite sparsely recorded, which is one of the interesting things about, this sense that they fall into a historical gap. They don't get kind of a lot of attention from medieval historians. So sometimes we have to sort of ferret out what happened to them from different sources. So I think in some ways it would have been quite hard to write a whole book about any one of these people. Maybe you could do it, but it would be quite hard. So, and then I also thought there was something interesting about kind of putting their stories alongside each other and thinking about which of them do get recorded by historians and which of them get ignored, how you can kind of put those parallel lives in contrast to each other and sort of see what emerges from that comparison.
And it also seemed like it's the story of these people, but also it's the story of the history as well, and like who's recording what and why are they recording it and what their perspective is. And that was interesting. It's quite different perspectives. It's not, you might imagine it's all, sort of woe and lamenting about the lost Saxon age, but actually they're quite different nuances to how they approach it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and that was kind of the other part of the story I was interested in as a kind of, from my literary side of it, I'm a literary historian really, and English literature and history writing was really changing in the years after the conquest as well, because, you get new, obviously the Norman historians are writing their version of events, but you're also getting the emergence of new kind of ways of writing about history, like romance, very kind of adventure focused way of telling stories about the past. And so we're getting different perspectives being recorded. And yeah, as you say, it's not all woe and lament, although there is a bit of that. There's also, an interest in kind of, how the people might respond to changing experiences, how they might even bring something positive out of it.
And I don't know if this is easier to sort of talk about within the individual stories or to take it as a whole, but sort of in terms of the language, like you're saying, that's sort of one of your areas of interest. Like, how much English history is there after 1066, or is it all Anglo-Norman or Norman or Scandinavian, some of it? But what English history is there?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because in one sense it's English history in that it's history about England, it's history about English people, but most of it's not being written in the English language. Definitely in the 12th century, when you're looking at 12th century historians, they tend to be in Latin or in French, or you're looking at kind of Scandinavian sources to try and fill in some of the gaps about what happened to these people. So the main source that continues to be written in the English language is one version of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, but that's obviously only giving us one kind of rather marginalised perspective. So yeah, the writing of English history becomes something that's being done in lots of other languages, and then of course other sorts of cultural perspectives obviously come along with that as well. So it's an interestingly kind of complicated picture by contrast to the period before the Norman Conquest, when pretty much there's still obviously writing in Latin in England, but there's a lot of history writing in the English language, and then that really fades away after the Norman Conquest.
It's fascinating because it's like so many things where the Normans it feels like the Saxons are written off as this sort of not exactly barbaric, but less sophisticated, less advanced, whereas actually, obviously we've seen from do the series about how actually the kingdom's really rich, it's really well governed, that's why you want to conquer it. Is there any sort of sense with that with the literature as well, that actually it's been kind of unfairly ignored or dismissed, and actually it was a rich scene that just gets taken away because of the conquest?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, Anglo-Saxon literature is incredibly rich and interesting and sophisticated. I mean, obviously people have heard of things like Beowulf, but there's a lot of Old English poetry that's very rich and complex and interesting. And of course, the Normans didn't understand any of that because they didn't mostly, for a long time after the conquest, didn't learn the English language. So it was all very kind of alien to them. And although some kinds of writing in English do carry on, I mean, things like religious writing, for instance, has to be in the language of most of the people, and most of the people were still speaking English. So, that tradition carries on into the 12th century. But things like the tradition of writing poetry just kind of dies out, and people, something like Beowulf just sat on a shelf in a library right through the centuries after the Norman Conquest and had to be completely rediscovered because nobody was reading it. Nobody knew how to read it after some point. So,
how was that rediscovered? How was it was just how and what point was that rediscovered?
So that starts to happen kind of in the 16th, 17th century when scholars get interested in Anglo-Saxon manuscripts and things like the remains of monastic libraries that had been dispersed at the Reformation. Manuscripts start to be kind of circulating again and being studied, but people had to kind of learn the Anglo-Saxon language again from scratch, teach themselves Old English. And it took quite a long time before, our current state of knowledge of Old English literature and language took ages to come to this position because, the English language just changed so much between, say, 1100 and 1600, kind of like almost an unrecognizable language.
Incredible. So, and that it was at that time it was all discovered because that's when historians had the luxury to delve into these dusty cupboards and find this stuff.
Yeah, and there was kind of more interest in it as well, and a desire to kind of rediscover the earliest stages of England's history and that kind of thing. So,
you're saying how the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, it's sort of Peterborough is where it continues, and that's sort of used as the first chapter in the book, and someone that you might imagine would have heard of as well, Hereward.
Mm-hmm.
Oh yeah,
Hereward the Wake, because that's all connected. So it's sort of the East Anglian, the Fenlands, and all that sort of stuff. So for anyone who's not come across Hereward before, and he definitely, maybe there's not enough for a book, but he definitely could get a movie.
Yes. Yeah.
Who's Hereward?
Yeah, so Hereward is the one who, there is quite a lot of writing about him from the Middle Ages, but most of it's rather fictional. So, these kind of stories and legends and romance about his adventures. Hereward is quite a shadowy figure in the historical sources, and he has this big afterlife in legend. What we know about him from the history is that he was probably a minor landowner in Lincolnshire kind of area, around Peterborough and in the Fens. And he got involved in the rebellion against the Normans, which was kind of centered on Ely in around 1070. And so he was kind of one of the figures involved in that rebellion. And then we don't really know what happened to him afterwards, in fact, but in legend, he kind of went on to have this career as a sort of Robin Hood kind of figure, an outlaw figure, hiding out in the fens and like playing tricks on the Normans and, kind of conducting this campaign of like guerrilla warfare against the Normans. So as I said, a lot of that's kind of fictional, but it's sorry, I know, but it has attracted a lot of interest, throughout. Like there are lots of novels about Hereward the Wake, for instance, because people have always kind of been fascinated by this rebel figure.
Why isn't there a film of that? That's brilliant.
It would be a good film.
He has all these adventures as well, which I knew about the Saxon bit, I guess, just because of looking at the resistance to William and stuff. But he had all these he goes around was it Ireland, and he goes off. That's right, yeah. And stuff as well, and that's before. And it's quite poignant actually, the fact that someone tells him, "Oh yeah, no, the Normans have England."
Yeah,
it's like
once abroad. Yeah.
Just good. Well, I mean, but certainly more violent. But all his little adventures, love it.
Well, I was thinking again because you said the Robin Hood comparison, and
that's better.
If we get you think Prince of Thieves, where he comes back from the Crusades, his father's been killed, his lands had been taken away, and that's kind of Hereward's setup. He's not on the crusade, but otherwise he's kind of doing the same thing.
Yeah, exactly. He comes back to England after the conquest to find that the Normans have stolen his lands and are kind of feasting in his hall, and they've murdered his brother, and they've kind of stuck his brother's head up on a pole, and it's this really kind of traumatic homecoming. And in fact, those Robin Hood type stories are actually, they do directly, go back to the medieval stories about Hereward. So there's, Robin Hood's more famous now, but he does, one of his ancestors in story terms is Hereward the Wake.
Wow.
Huh. And we mentioned coming into this with the Peterborough element and the regional element. So there's these these East Anglian sources that seem to particularly celebrate him. So when we were saying at the start about the different perspectives and whether it's lamenting or whether it's looking forward, and actually the different versions of his tales reflect those different approaches. So what are the different Herewards depending on what your take on the conquest is?
Yeah, that's right. So one version is the one I've been talking about, he's this great freedom fighter and anti-Norman rebel and so on. But then actually what he really did, as far as we can tell, in that very sort of violent, tumultuous period just after the conquest, was that he seems to have teamed up with the Danish fleet who were coming to get involved and take advantage of all this chaos in England. And one of the things he supposedly did was that he sacked Peterborough Cathedral and stole a lot of its treasures and gave or sold them to the Danes, and Peterborough never got them back again. So from the Peterborough point of view, he was a bit of a villain, really. They were not fans of Hereward. But at Ely, they saw him in a much more positive light. So yeah, it really depended who you asked.
I went to school in Ely, and one of the houses is called Hereward, and so I was familiar with his story. And that's presumably because there's rivalry with Peterborough.
Yeah.
I didn't know that bit.
Got the chance to get one over.
Yeah,
in the Peters. I also was really interested to read about the fens, particularly in Hereward's story, because obviously that it was later drained, and we know it's very different now to how it was before. But it was the fact that even in the 12th century, it was a very different place to how it would have been for Hereward. Yeah. How was it they built a bridge or a causeway?
Yeah, absolutely. So, somewhere like Ely really was an island in this very watery, marshy kind of landscape. So it was quite hard to access, which is why it's a good place for the rebels to kind of hole up and, have a sort of stand against the Normans. But yeah, for the Normans to attack the island of Ely, they had to build this big causeway. And then, there's all these stories about the causeway collapsing and they all fall into the marsh, and, it's a kind of disaster for them, these kinds of stories. So yeah, it was a really very different landscape from what we would know now, much more sort of, difficult to navigate if you didn't know the area. And Hereward does, that's his big advantage. He can kind of hop around between these islands and, and outsmart the Normans who don't know the territory, that kind of thing.
Yeah. That's lovely. It doesn't have the glamour if you can't get a horse in it. I bet that's why there's no film. Yeah. You're sort of like a little muddy frog Robin Hood.
Yeah. Yeah. But you could do the Disney one. You've got the reeds, doesn't it?
Yes, you could. If he were actually a frog, this really works. Yes. Let's workshop this out.
So is there he was involved, or said to be involved in, some of the rebellions, and particularly the Danish element? But presumably there's not really a connection. Is there a connection between him and Edgar, or are these sort of resistances that don't really actually ever meet?
Yeah, so it doesn't seem like Edgar was involved in the Ely revolt. So there were these kind of different stages of where rebellion was kind of being focused in different parts of the country. And, first of all, after the conquest, the first place where it kind of breaks out is around Exeter in the southwest. And then you get York, and Edgar was definitely involved at York. But then the stage where they've all moved down to Ely, some of the rebels had moved from York to Ely, but it doesn't seem like Edgar was involved at that point. So we don't know that Edgar and Hereward ever had anything to do with each other.
Shame. And it does seem to shame, and it seems sort of in the slightly silly thing of being partisan about these events that were 1,000 years ago. But like you say, you've got the Godwins in the southwest, you've got stuff happening in York, you've got East Anglia. You think, why could they not just have, coordinated?
Yeah, I know.
They could have kicked him out, because it's amazing how much resistance there is to William. And you think he's just able to pick them off one by one. But actually, if all of that had been directed in some way, or if you had a kind of someone really at the centre of events. So it feels like Edgar was never quite able to be that person. Perhaps, that fair to say.
No, well, I mean, I might be romanticising this, but it's as if Oscar Wilde were to meet Bertie Wooster. They're around at the same time, and one's fictional, but they're, like, it'd be so great if they did exist in the same world together, Edgar and him.
We can but dream. But yeah, so sort of going on to Edgar then in a bit more detail. Because it was sad as well, which I'd sort of come across in the research. Like William of Malmesbury particularly seems to be really down on Edgar for no particular reason. And it was really interesting because where you talk about him, it's not his chapter, it's his sister's chapter, St. Margaret of Scotland. And that's perhaps because actually weirdly, that's what the chroniclers all do. It feels like Edgar is kind of deliberately sidelined. It's not just that we forget him, it's that everyone shifts. So why, even though Edgar's the last royal prince and all of that, why is he ignored and dismissed, but Margaret is the focal point?
Well, I think for at least part of it is a conscious decision to sideline him and kind of write him out of the story. I mean, if you think about something like the Bayeux Tapestry as, the first Norman attempt to take control of all of the lead up to Hastings and to talk about, Edward, or to represent Edward the Confessor and his relationship with Harold and all of that kind of stuff. Where is Edgar Ætheling on the Bayeux Tapestry? It's just completely written out of the story. And I think from the Norman point of view, it was obviously in their interest to just pretend he didn't exist as much as possible, because he had by birth a very strong claim to the throne. And from the Norman point of view, it was much more beneficial to kind of focus on Harold, because you could present Harold as a usurper and someone who just seized the throne because he was power hungry and all that kind of thing. You could blacken Harold's reputation. And you couldn't do any of that with Edgar. He hadn't done anything wrong. And, if there was any sense that Edward the Confessor had wanted Edgar to inherit from him, obviously that would be in conflict with the Norman claim that, William was Edward's chosen heir. So, certainly in those kind of first decades after the conquest, they just prefer to pretend that Edgar doesn't exist, I think, really. And then the kind of later consequence of that is that when 12th century historians come along, they then don't know very much about Edgar. They can't track his life, or like William of Malmesbury, they kind of just conclude, he probably wasn't very clever or interesting, otherwise he would have done something more or whatever. So I think he kind of initially is deliberately written out of the history. And the only place where he is being kind of written about really is still within the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, where the chroniclers, the English chroniclers, really do want to record what he's doing and where he's going and, see him as still really important. But the Norman writers are not interested, and quite deliberately so.
Whereas Margaret is the one that gets ultimately, of course, that's where the line continues, because she marries Malcolm of Scotland, and then obviously it comes back.
Yeah, exactly. So, and then from 1100, when Henry I marries Margaret's daughter and has kind of united himself to the female descendants of the Anglo-Saxon royal line, then you can kind of present her life as a form of continuity, as something that can be, joined up to the Norman kings and give them this link to the pre-conquest dynasty. And obviously also because she comes to be seen as a saint, there's a lot of writing about her, which is kind of interpreting her life as kind of like God's plan for England and for Scotland, that, she could kind of do good work as a kind of Christian saint in Scotland as well. So there's a lot of a kind of reinterpreting the story of her life from that point of view. And you can't do that with Edgar's story. It's just too awkward and it doesn't kind of fit in.
There's no happy ending, but also no tragic ending either. It just sort of carries on.
Brilliant. He manages to complete Norman England, which is a tough landscape.
Yeah, I found that fascinating then, the idea of Margaret as, like you said, as providence, the idea that these writers struggling to understand how something so cataclysmic could happen. And it's okay, because look, we've got Margaret, and then she has these children, and it's come back, so it's all fine. It's Margaret makes sense of this. Otherwise, it's just horror.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And you just see this sense, I mean, again, this is mostly coming from the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, of they can't understand why the Battle of Hastings happened. Why did God allow this to happen? Well, it must have been because we were sinful, because we deserved it. And yet maybe somehow good is going to come out of it. So they're trying to make sense of something that's just very traumatic and seems to make no kind of logical sense. They're trying to kind of find some way to understand it.
Because actually, we hadn't done the Nearly Monarch series, because we let our sort of people on Patreon, our Privy Councillors vote, and it beat by one vote the alternative, which was Scottish consorts.
Okay.
So we could have, at this stage in our podcast, have been doing an episode on Margaret rather than Edgar. So we're always going to do one of them. So I think people are going to get a little bit of chance to talk about her. And I was also interested in the fact that you wrote how, is it Turgot or Turgot? How would you say it?
I usually say Turgut, but yeah.
Turgot like turbot. How he kind of deliberately writes out the Saxon bit. Like when he writes this great hagiography, you'd expect that's where we get all of this information, and yet he kind of pushes the Saxon bit.
That's right. It's quite frustrating, really, because that would have been such a good, because he knew her, you know, he would have been such a good source to tell us more about, like, her mother, for instance. We don't know hardly anything about Edgar and Margaret's mother, and that would have, you know, but anyway, yeah, because he's kind of trying to reinterpret the story in a way that's suitable for Margaret's daughter, who's now kind of aligned herself with the Norman kings and is, you know, sort of obviously got a political interest in not talking too much about the Saxon side of things and really focusing on the connections to the Norman line.
It's frustrating. But do you think, well, because you think, well, that's must be what it was good for Henry about marrying.
Exactly.
Yeah. She had that Saxon line, but it's like, yes, we understand you're important, but we don't really want to talk about any of the specifics of it.
Yeah.
I was also just interested in, which I think whenever I mention her on the podcast, it always feels like it's in quite a negative light. So I like the fact there was a bit of an alternative spin on the other sister that gets forgotten about of the three of them, Christina. Because the only anecdote where she ever really seems to have any role in history is where her niece, Edith Matilda, is with her at the Abbey, and there's the question over whether Edith is really a nun or not a nun. And she says, oh, well, it was my wicked aunt shouting at me and forcing me to wear this thing. But I think you were writing about how actually maybe she's got a more protective role.
Yeah.
In all of this.
Yeah, I think, I mean, you can absolutely read that story. You know, it's kind of being told to deliberately cast Christina as this person she's trying to make Edith a nun, and she doesn't want to be a nun because she's obviously wants to be free to marry, Henry I. So it's kind of, there's an agenda towards presenting her in a bad light. And I think you can absolutely also read the story as being, she's trying to protect her very young niece against these predatory men who are quite keen to, you know, they're focusing on her as a target for marriage because of her ancestry. So Christina might well have felt very protective and sort of seen, you know, the kind of making her dress as a nun or something is about saying she's kind of off limits, you know.
Unavailable, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's so, that's a really human perspective to have, whereas I think it's previously it'd all been, oh, she must have been well up for this. You know, it's very male-dominated history, isn't it?
Well, and you just think, I mean, we don't really know anything about Christina, so we can't kind of say too much about it. But, you know, she had witnessed Margaret being married off to King Malcolm, whether or not she wanted to. So she obviously, and, you know, experienced a lot of disruption in her own life, and seen, you know, what happens when people get kind of forced into marriages or into positions against their will. And, you know, I think if she was angry, I feel like I couldn't blame her, to be honest.
And you also said that there was the potential that she might have been, so one of the other subjects in the book, Waltheof, who's sort of the last Saxon earl, that she might potentially have been involved in preserving sort of some of his life story.
Yeah, there's some sense that he seems to have been remembered at Romsey and Christina was at Romsey, so it's just an interesting possible connection.
I love all of those, just little hints of information where it makes a bit more sense when you map people out and where they are. The other thing I suppose Margaret, I guess, is she's quite representative, because the way we see, obviously she's a saint, she becomes the Queen of Scots, it's kind of this very elevated position, but like you say, actually there's a point at which she's following a path that lots of Saxon women would have been, which was seek safety in a nunnery. So is that the fate of a lot of the sort of highborn Saxon girls or young women, is that their only option, really? That
does seem to have been the case, unless they could leave England, as some of them did. It does seem like, you know, taking refuge in a nunnery was a kind of a means of finding protection, because they did, you know, there was a reason why new Norman landowners might try and kind of marry the daughter of the previous landowner or something. It's a way of legitimizing their claim to the land. And some of them did do that. So if you didn't want to, you know, be targeted for marriage in that way, then a nunnery was maybe your safest option.
That's the case for, is it Gunhild? Is that Harold's daughter that is also, and is she there? Is she actually with Edith, or although it's separate?
Yeah, no, at Wilton Abbey, yeah. So with her aunt, Edith. And yeah, so she was there. She was at Wilton for quite some time after the conquest, and presumably she was kind of left behind when the rest of her family went off for Flanders and Denmark. And but at some point she ended up leaving the nunnery and living with Alan Rufus. She also ended up in one of those kinds of relationships where, a new landowner is kind of maybe seeking out a remnant of a Saxon family. But the details are really murky on that one, so we don't absolutely know what happened.
And I was interested. Again, I found it really interesting because you've got, like you said, actually, it's the benefit of having all these different stories in one book that you kind of draw the parallels, all the differences between them in the way you might not if you did them separately. But having Edgar, the Ætheling, having the Godwins or the Godwinsons or the Godwinsons, and Waltheof, I found it really interesting thinking with Edgar there because, so Waltheof is the last Saxon earl, and he's the only one that actually gets executed.
They only execute one Saxon earl, the Normans.
Well, after they kill quite a few at Hastings, obviously, but that's their game.
But once they sort of draw a line in the bloody mud and say, that's all right.
Yeah.
Wow. That's very un-Norman, isn't it? I thought they'd...
Well, yeah, that's the thing I found interesting thinking about comparing them. So, Waltheof gets to be earl, he gets to marry, and you think, oh, this is all right. Poor Edgar, he doesn't get a wife, he doesn't get a title. He's just, is itinerant boy trying to find someone to help him fulfill his destiny. But yeah, Waltheof ends up getting his head cut off, and it feels a bit harsh and unfair. Whereas Edgar, despite being kind of the legitimate claimant, just keeps on rebelling, getting forgiven, carrying on. So I found it really weird comparing the two. It felt like Waltheof gets all these benefits early on, but then head chopped off. Whereas Edgar, they don't. I don't know what I'm thinking. Why were they so harsh in the end to Waltheof, or why didn't they do that to Edgar? I suppose.
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting comparison, and because I guess the point at which that decision was being made is immediately after the collapse of the 1069 rebellion, when you've got these kind of William's confronted with these still very young Anglo-Saxon, men of kind of noble descent, and what's he going to do with them? It would be a really inflammatory thing to just execute them at that point. But you could imagine he was quite wary of the fact that they might continue to rebel. And I guess his intention with Waltheof was, Waltheof was the son of a former Earl of Northumbria. He was descended on his mother's side from ancient Earls of Northumbria. So he had really kind of deep roots in the north of England that William was trying to kind of get control of. And Northumbria was always a rather challenging place for southern kings to rule. So, William perhaps saw the potential of Waltheof as someone, okay, I can use this guy to help me get control of the north of England and, kind of bind him to loyalty with William by arranging the marriage and all that kind of thing. And if Waltheof had stayed loyal, he probably would have, lived a very a prosperous life as Earl of Northumbria. But he, got involved in this second rebellion, and then he, gets his head, and then it's kind of like he's pushed William's patience too far, or William realizes he can't use him the way that he wanted to. Whereas Edgar never gets given, an earldom or anything like that. He's kind of kept down, I think, and William doesn't, William could have been much harsher to him. He could have executed him. He could have kept him in prison his whole life. The Normans were perfectly happy to, one of Harold Godwinson's younger brothers spent his entire life basically in Norman captivity. But so Edgar was kind of left free to roam around, but he wasn't allowed to build up any kind of power base in England that could be the basis for later rebellion. So I think William was quite strategic in the way that he was handling these people. Is
it damning of Edgar that William never executed him? Does it imply that he was like, come on, Danny, this guy, he's never actually going to do anything that we need to worry about, is he? Or is
at some point, maybe
that no one thinks that he can be, because otherwise he'd be dead.
Yeah. I think maybe at some point William was kind of happy to say, actually, Saxon rebellion has weakened to the point that I don't need to worry so much about Edgar anymore. But then also you can think, well, if he had him executed, you've sort of created a martyr then, haven't you? But because he was so young, and and yes, he'd rebelled against the Normans in 1069, but that's not exactly enough to deserve being summarily executed at the age of, I don't know, less than 20 or whatever, where he still was. And then you're killing off the last heir of the Anglo-Saxon royal line. It's a pretty drastic thing to do. And I think in terms of, you could imagine that might have created a lot of even more bad feeling on the English side if he'd, treated Edgar in that really harsh way.
It's got all the makings of a film. It's all the opportunity, isn't it, to paint in the colour in the blanks.
It's interesting because we think of obviously William being such a harsh ruler to the English, and obviously particularly in the north with how he responds, and yet I can't imagine Canute would have let Edgar just wander around rebelling against him every few years. I think he would have been straight for the chop if Canute had been there, and yet Canute's the slightly more cuddly Viking.
Yeah, absolutely. I think when you compare it to Canute, Canute would have not hesitated to, dispose of Edgar in one way or another. Yeah.
Oh, any king for the next 800 years. It's just very odd. But it makes me think that he had something on William, like a USB stick tucked down his tunic.
Or William is just misunderstood.
But look at his nickname, for goodness sake.
So Waltheof, and we haven't said too much about him, actually. I mean, the circumstances of it, because actually it was controversial, even though he's not exactly, he doesn't become a martyr, but it did feel like everyone thought it was a bit harsh. Like it was sort of almost second-hand rebellion, wasn't it? It was almost that he didn't tell William about a rebellion that he didn't exactly...
Yeah, that's right. It was and the rebellion, it was like, it's known as the Revolt of the Earls, but the other two earls, who were not Anglo-Saxon earls, they were kind of William's appointees, were much more the leaders of the revolt. And Waltheof was kind of like, he just knew about it and he didn't sort of tell William. So, yeah, it did. I think clearly some people at the time saw it as an overreaction and as too harsh, and indeed, did in fact almost treat Waltheof as a martyr. In Crowland, they treated him as a saint and a martyr, which is where he was buried. So, you can kind of see even at the time there were quite sharply divergent opinions on whether Waltheof kind of had it coming or whether William was being too harsh with him.
So just a quick message to say that Rex Factor are going to be doing a live show at the Ludlow Assembly Rooms on Friday the 21st of August at 7 o'clock p.m. We're going to be looking at the four main contenders for the throne in 1066, Harold Godwinson, William the Conqueror, Harold Hardrada and Edgar the Ætheling, and we're going to ask the audience who comes to the show to decide who should have become the king. We've had lots of fun. We've been to Ludlow in previous years and we've really loved getting the chance to meet Rex Factor fans in person. So if you are able to, then please do come along to join us on Friday, 21st of August at the Ludlow Assembly Rooms. You can get tickets directly from the Ludlow Assembly Rooms website, or we will have a link to it on our website, rexfactorpodcast.com. Hopefully we'll get to see you there.
I was also thinking with another chapter in here, whether we should have been doing any of these as nearly monarchs. And it's another one where I just completely don't think of them after Hastings, but the Godwin family. And it's interesting the way that they just kind of immediately fall off a cliff of kind of interest or people looking at them. But you think, well, actually, because Harold has sons, doesn't he? Actually probably like, are they adult sons or at least teenage sons?
Teenagers at least, yeah.
And they rebel. You think, well, they're almost nearly monarchs in a way, aren't they? They would probably have assumed that they would one day be killing each other to become King of England. So what does that tell us something about Harold, or is it again just the desire to completely play down the Godwins as a legitimate family? Like, how do they just get forgotten about so quickly?
Yeah, that's a really interesting one, because as you say, I mean, one of the interesting what ifs about the Conquest is if Harold had managed to be king for more than 9 months, if he'd stayed king for a significant point of time, who would he have intended as his heir? Surely he would have wanted his oldest son to succeed him, and not Edgar Ætheling, who would have so at that point there might well have been some interesting conflict. Anyway, but yeah, so you've got these these sons of Harold, and they are again kind of written out of history a bit. They're not. The Norman chroniclers kind of don't really want to acknowledge that Harold was ever a legitimate king. So to be interested in his children, or to imagine that they were in any sense royal children, is obviously in opposition to that. But the other part of it is that they kind of disappear off the English scene pretty quickly after the Conquest. So unlike Waltheof and Edgar, they don't stick around in England. They rebel in the late 1060s and then head off to ultimately to Denmark, where their mother's family were, and where they were connected to Svein Estridsson, the King of Denmark. So, they kind of almost seem to have like turned their backs on England. And that means that their fates aren't really recorded in English sources, and we have to look to, particularly to Scandinavian sources, to know what happened to them. And in fact, we don't know what happened to Harold's sons, not his oldest sons anyway. That's a bit of a mystery. So, yeah, I think it's those two things. It's the Norman historians not wanting to write about them, but also this sense that they had just kind of given up on trying to preserve their family in England, really.
It's just bizarre when you think of Harold's so dominant and the family so dominant for this period before the conquest, and then just suddenly, whoosh, off they go. It's just a really strange. You just couldn't imagine. Obviously, I suppose any of it, but you think in 1065, the idea that family would just almost just disappear from England, just be bizarre. But then, like you say, actually, it's an interesting, like I think in the book, how the identities of the people there at the time, and actually they're not all just Anglo-Saxon, and there is a strong Anglo-Danish or Anglo-Scandinavian population. I guess maybe you've got, like with Wulfthulf, you said he's got this strong roots in the north. Edgar is the Saxon royal, but actually he's come off from Hungary. And the Godwins, maybe they do have this sense that they're part Scandinavian in their outlook as well, and it's not as simple as English history at that point.
Yeah, and maybe that made it easier for them to kind of turn their back on England in a way, because obviously on Godwin's side of the family, they were English, but they weren't really from a particularly distinguished family. The family had kind of come out of nowhere as a result of Canute's conquest, because, Geitha, Godwin's wife, was a close relative of Canute. So they'd sort of shot to power in the, 1020s, and then they were out of power again by the late 1060s. It's, it all happened quite fast. But they were maybe in that sense more divided in their loyalties, rather compared to Edgar. I mean, yes, his mother, we don't quite know where she came from, but Hungary or somewhere like that. But obviously in terms of his ancestry, it went way back into the, he's looking back to people like Alfred the Great and stuff. So, that sense of a tie to England must have been quite a lot stronger for him than for the Godwinsons, I would think, or the children of the Godwinsons.
And I guess that's part of the problem with the sort of post-1066, the different groups that could have resisted William, but they're just not. They're not on the same page. You can't imagine Edgar and the Godwins teaming up. Yeah. Can't imagine them lining up behind this sort of child Edgar as his figurehead.
Yeah, maybe they saw him as a rival as well,
Yeah. I also had never quite really put together, because it's impressive that Harold's mother is still alive at this point and still quite an active player. And I just never sort of put together the fact that from her perspective in 1066, in a few weeks, she loses, is it 4 of the brothers that...
Oh, God.
You have Stamford Bridge and Hastings. Just what a horrific thing, just as an individual.
Yeah, absolutely.
From that perspective.
Yeah. Within just a few weeks, Tosti and at Stamford Bridge, and then the 3 at Hastings.
Shocking. But then, like you said, there's this other one who... is it Wulfnoth? The other brother. Who, like you said, he's imprisoned by the Normans, but that's even before Hastings that they've got a hold of him. So how has he found himself a Norman prisoner before there's even been a Norman conquest?
So that goes back to the conflict between Edward the Confessor and the Godwin family, because they had that very contentious, fractious relationship. And at that point where Edward and the Godwins really fell out, and then had to, the Godwins kind of forced their way back into England, and they had to make peace. There was a point at which they gave hostages to Edward. And it seems that at that point, I mean, it is a little bit uncertain, but I think it's at that point that they were kind of Wulfnoth and also one of Godwin's grandsons, so maybe a son of his oldest son Svein, get kind of in Norman captivity, and they sort of just never come out again, or at least Wulfnoth never comes out again.
It's just really unlucky, the fact that that should have just been a temporary thing, and then the man that's imprisoned him ends up overthrowing his brother, who wasn't meant to be king either, and it's really not worked out well for Wulfnoth.
Yeah, pretty unlucky.
Yeah. And also that we have a continuation of their line. It's unfortunate there's a lot of Githers in the family, aren't there? But one of them is almost like a Margaret figure in that she becomes the queen. And so what's her story, and where does that continue?
So that she's kind of the one that we do know more about. I mean, we know, interestingly, just more what happened to Harold's daughters than we do to his sons, because we know about Gunhild in Wilton and then her sister Geitha. And Geitha left England after the rebellion in the southwest failed, the older Geitha, Harold's mother, and a number of other English women and their families kind of left England. And as I said, they ended up in the Danish court. And Svein Estridsson, so this is Geitha's nephew, kind of we don't know what happened with the Harold's sons at that point, but Svein Estridsson arranged for the daughter, Geitha, to marry the future Grand Prince of Kiev. So into the kind of, the Scandinavian courts had a strong connection to the Rus, the people in what's now kind of Russia, Ukraine, that sort of area. And And so she, got married off into to that region. And, her husband went on to become a powerful man, and they had children, and she lived on for quite some time. So, she maintained royal status. And her descendants then married back into other European royal families in subsequent decades and, the years after. So, she's the one who, in one sense, kind of carries on the legacy of Harold when all of his other children have sort of faded into history.
And it's fascinating how I was with Margaret as well. Like we said, how so often women are written out of history. And yet with the Conquest, it's the women's lives a lot of the time, because of their marrying and continuing the line, that they're the ones that actually we do know about, and a lot of the men sort of disappear. It's interesting how the Conquest has that weird shift in focus.
Yeah, and because then it's often their descendants, like as you talked about Waltheof's daughter, and it's the same with Margaret's daughter, it's their descendants who are kind of then recording the history of the family and the history of their ancestry. And so they give us the best sources often, through those marriages and the offspring.
So I really like that when we did our previous series, we did the English consort. So when we did Edith Matilda and how sort of her role in getting these histories written, I don't know, for some reason you always sort of, because of the episodic nature of doing a biographical podcast, but you always sort of see them in isolation. And I'd always like it when you see this sense that actually they do know where they come from. They want to preserve this history, that they do obviously have this sense of it beyond simply this chaotic moment that they're living in, that they are wanting to preserve a history as well as their own lives.
Yeah.
Now, Ali is a big fan, by which I mean not a big fan, of a chap called Dunstan.
Okay.
So we did the English monarchs in our first series, the English consorts in the third, Scottish monarchs in the second, and he never failed to appear in a series. He appeared an awful lot in the first series, so Ali got rather fed up with him.
Persistent bad smell.
Exactly, the fun sponge was a unique name to him. And so I was obviously delighted when the final chapter on Edgar, it seems that actually Dunstan very important to some of the surviving English historians.
So, yes.
So who is Edgar, and why is Dunstan so important to you?
Yeah, so Edgar is a kind of the bit of the odd one out in the book. He's not from a powerful family. He's not a rebel. He's not a survivor of someone powerful before the Conquest. But he is a very important figure because he was a historian. So he wrote about English history. He was a monk at Christ Church, Canterbury, and he was born just before the Conquest. And he kind of lived through the aftermath. And then in later life, he wrote a lot about pre-Conquest English history, including St. Dunstan, who was one of his heroes, one of Canterbury's major saints at that point. And in the process of writing about that, Edgar provides some really important information about kind of the aftermath of the Conquest and how that was experienced more, not at the level that we've been talking about so far, that kind of elite level of society, but kind of, in a monastery like Canterbury, Christ Church Canterbury, for instance. So stories about Dunstan and like how his ghost was supposed to be kind of intervening in disputes in the monastery in around 1066, 1067. This is a very fraught time, a part of Edgar's contribution to the story of the aftermath of the Conquest.
It was actually, because we were mentioning Dunstan, the recording we were doing just before now, and you were saying Ali had got this view of him as almost this sort of really strict sort of headmastery type figure.
Yeah.
And he sort of is in that role in some of Edmund's things, but he's a little bit more generous. He sort of is it slightly more protective outlook from Edmund.
Yeah.
So there's an alternative side to fake.
No, I mean and yet here we are still talking about Dunstan. This is the problem.
But also it seemed like, because like Margaret, going back to Margaret of Scotland, how when she names her children, the sons, initially she's going back in that line. And it goes back to Edgar, and then she goes off and goes for completely different names after that. So is there this sort of sense that like Edgar and Dunstan, like that is the definitive point of Anglo-Saxon history that they kind of all look back to with when they have the rose-tinted glasses and they are lamenting? Is that the moment they're looking back to, is when everything was right with the world?
Yeah. There's this specific kind of tradition of writing about pre-Conquest history, which is very much a monastic one, because Edgar and Dunstan were, supporters of monastic reform in the late 10th century. It was a great time of founding of new monasteries and flourishing of monastic life and all of that kind of thing. So when it's immediately followed by Ethelred the Unready and all of the disruption and chaos of the Viking invasions, and then, of course, all of the disruption of the 11th century, kind of later writers look back to the 970s and Edgar's time as this sort of golden age, when the king was so supportive of the English church, and everything was kind of flourishing and beautiful, before everything kind of descended into chaos. So yeah, they do very much look back to that point, and kind of see that as far as they see it, everything's been in decline since that time.
So Edmund, it's an interesting one for me because he's sort of the least famous one there, but if we were to go back to like pre-podcast Graham, he'd have been the only one I'd really heard of, particularly because because I did at A level, I did a module at university as well. I did philosophy and ethics.
Okay.
And Anselm was on there. So, and he's got this very close relationship with Anselm, and he writes Anselm's life. So I'd heard of Edmund just because I knew about Anselm. And again, it was weird when we came to do Rex Factor and Anselm being an actual historical person rather than someone that had a theory about the existence of God. But yes, it's quite interesting to get to see actually the man behind this obscure bit of A-level history for me. But he's also, we talk about how like he is a Saxon. Like you said, he's English. He's not highborn, but he is actually a Saxon there who's a Saxon historian. And he does have this perspective of a world he sort of remembers, but he has this close relationship with one of the most important people in the Anglo-Norman world. So is he someone that's commemorating the Saxon world, or is he more someone that's building the Anglo-Norman vision of England?
Yeah, it's really interesting because he is very much this kind of transitional figure. He thinks of himself as English. He can just about remember the world before the conquest, but he was quite young. He was only about like 6 or something at the time of the Battle of Hastings. So it's really very much just a distant memory, but one he's very attached to. And yet in his adult life, he does have this really close relationship with Anselm. He also really respects Lanfranc, and both of them have only come to Canterbury because, as a direct result of the Norman conquest. So he's living in this Anglo-Norman world, and it's kind of shaping his entire outlook and what he's remembered for, as you say. The places people might encounter him outside stories of the conquest is as a biographer of St Anselm, and then also as a historian, who wrote quite an important history of what he calls history of recent times, but particularly around the times around the Norman conquest. So he became an influential figure in the writing of history. 12th century writers kind of refer back to him and so on. So he is very much like an important figure in the culture of the Anglo-Norman world, and yet he has these roots in just about in the pre-conquest world that he's very sort of strongly attached to.
It was poignant. I think you said how it's kind of later on in his life that he's really sort of doing the Saxon history bit. It's almost like he sort of gets to the end and starts to reflect on those things at the start of his life.
Yeah, he's kind of looking back, once he's an old man, on his earliest childhood memories. And the cathedral at Canterbury burned down very close to the time of the Norman conquest, and that was obviously his home and the place that he was very emotionally attached to. And so those two things are kind of connected in his mind: the destruction of Canterbury Cathedral and the conquest, these two kind of connected disasters for him. And in the 1120s, so decades after the conquest, he's writing about these things and kind of piecing together his earliest memories. So it's an interesting way of kind of getting closer to the experience of someone who did live through these tumultuous years, someone who wasn't a political player, even though, he was important as a writer, but was kind of aware of things, was witnessing things, and reflecting on them and what it meant for him and for England.
And I hadn't realised that about Canterbury. There was the fire so soon afterwards. That must be such powerful symbolism that the church, the centre of the kingdom, burns down the year after the kingdom falls. Conquest.
Yeah. God.
Devastating, isn't it? Now, Edmund also interested me because he's, like you said, the fact that he's kicking around in the 1120s, and so is Edgar as well, isn't he? Because Edgar's still, according to William, still alive in the countryside, going around at this point. So they're sort of like the end of this last generation of Anglo-Saxon children. So I mean, and obviously this is the next generation. But for those who are around in the 1120s and that are old, do we have any sense that I don't know if this is possible to track, but whether there's this continued into the next generation sense of the lament and the loss, or do they just have to grow up, and if they're born within the Conquest, is that just a world that they just don't see? It's been written out and it's been taken away, or is there this long lingering sense of, I think it's sort of the Norman yoke is the trope in the historical, isn't it? But is there something there that we know about in real life, or is that something that we impose on?
Well, I think that's where the stories about Hereward become interesting, because they sort of start to be recorded sort of around the same time in the 1120s and then on into the 12th century. And we do see this kind of romanticization of the Anglo-Saxon past. And, you know, that later idea of the Norman yoke kind of draws on a lot of that medieval, idealization of the pre-conquest world as something that was, you know, there was more liberty and more freedom. And then the Normans come in and impose this incredibly harsh system. So I think there's, even, you know, as the realities of Anglo-Saxon history kind of recede out of living memory, people are still very interested in writing about that period, but obviously they're kind of reinterpreting it from their own perspective. And as you get further into the 12th century, the populations become more and more mixed together. You know, there's intermarriage, and people start to, you know, have like one Norman parent, one English parent is, you know, a typical story of the next generation. And so obviously they have a different attitude to English history, but they're still very interested in the pre-conquest past. And there is for quite some time, you know, still this sense that, you know, like if you were, there are stories from the 12th century about, you know, like people of English birth who feel kind of aggrieved because if you don't learn French or you can't learn French, you can never get on in the world. You know, the expectation is that you adopt Norman customs and you learn to speak French, because if you're English, you're kind of always at a disadvantage. So that sense of a kind of, political grievance does continue for quite some time after the Norman conquest, even after this first generation have passed away.
Well, thanks so much for talking to us about all of this. It's really fascinating, really interesting to get that sort of perspective of kind of the what comes after, which I think we always really lose. Before I ask if there's anything else that, you know, we haven't covered, I've realised just the last couple of minutes I haven't asked what the lovely big document behind you.
Well, you see, I've got Harold Godwinson here, a small Harold. This is this actually came from the cafe at Canterbury Cathedral when they were selling off their decorations, and so they made this big poster thing of a document which is an agreement between the monks of Christchurch and William just after the conquest. So it's like their kind of post-conquest agreement.
Nice.
Perfect backdrop.
Yeah,
so what's the Harold? We couldn't quite see. You wasn't quite in focus.
I thought that was a seal.
No, this is little Harold.
Oh, yeah. Getting something out of his eye.
Yep.
Lovely. Well, so, I mean, is there anything that like we haven't covered today on the topic that you think is sort of a thing you'd like to leave people with, or that people should take away? Or
I don't think so. I think we've had a good comprehensive discussion.
Lovely. Well, thanks so much for joining us. If anyone wants to sort of find out more about you or access any of your other works and things, where should they go to find out more?
Good question. I'm just generally around on the internet. I think. I mean, I've written a couple of other books about the Vikings in England, and also the seasonal cycle in Anglo-Saxon England. So if people are interested in those topics, they could look me up.
And although it's not updated anymore, the Clerk of Oxford blogspot's got loads and loads and loads of stuff on it. So people haven't had a look at that and they're interested in this period, then that's definitely worth.
Yeah, lots about Dunstan, if that's what people want to hear.
Brilliant. Well,
thanks, Eleanor.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thanks.
Yeah.
So that was Eleanor Parker on the last children of Anglo-Saxon England. And plenty of Dunstan.
There was enough. Yeah, there was enough, wasn't there? I think we can agree that there was enough Dunstan.
If you'd like to get in touch, you can find us on our various social media and email, all of which you'll find the links to on our website, rexfactorpodcast.com. And if you'd like to support the podcast, leave a review and subscribe on whatever podcast provider you use, and sign up for loads of bonus content at patreon.com/rexfactor, where you get an ad-free version of this podcast, as well as over 450 bonus episodes.
That's the hard sell. You know, is this one free?
This one's free.
See? That all that content, free. Exactly. Imagine what you get if you pay for it.
Yeah, imagine if I was actually trying for this. If I actually paid for this, imagine what I'd be like.
Yeah, the premium content.
So that's all. So that is all from us today. Hopefully you enjoyed that interview with Eleanor. Our next episode will be a right to reply episode where we respond to all of your messages.
If you pay.
No, that's for everybody.
Oh.
I'm not mentioning the ones that aren't the next episode for everybody because that seems...
behind the secret paywall. We're keeping it... Okay. Nice.
Just thought people might like to know what the next thing they will see in their feed is. Restricted access.
Does it say that?
I don't think so. Well, I mean, it might actually. I think on Spotify now it might show you bonus episodes
that you can't get
to encourage you to realise that there are
that's
these
good.
episodes. So.
I mean, from a commercial point of view. We Have Ways. No, I'm a full member of We Have Ways. There's another one like Look Inside the Cockpit or something like that, and they definitely have on Patreon a thing.
It annoys me, but I can see how it benefits.
Yeah.
Well, the next episode in the normal feed of Rex Factor will be the Right to Reply episode for the Saxon Nearly Monarchs. So all the messages we've been getting during the series, we will be responding to those. And then after that, we'll be moving on to the Norman Nearly Monarchs.
Yeah, we're rattling through.
Indeed. See you next time.
Bye.